The spring of 1945 was not a season of rebirth in Europe. It was a season of collapse. The cities that had once echoed with patriotic speeches now shook with artillery. Bridges lay in rivers. Fields were burned. And the sky was streaked with the smoke of a crumbling empire. Among the chaos were women who had not chosen the war, yet were trapped inside it, daughters of farmers, schoolgirls turned nurses, secretaries drafted into the Reich's communications corps. Many were barely 20. When Allied troops took their hospital stations and supply depots, these women surrendered quietly. They had heard rumors. Americans shot prisoners. Americans hated Germans. Americans were monsters. And yet, the moment the rifles lowered, nothing happened. No curses, no mistreatment. An American medic even knelt to bandage a woman's hand where glass had cut her during the chaos of capture. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the gentleness. They were transported across the Atlantic, an unimaginable journey for women who had never seen the sea. The ocean air was cold. The waves roared like distant artillery. Many cried silently, believing they were being taken to forced labor or punishment camps. Some whispered prayers. Others just stared into the endless black water, imagining home fading behind them. But when they arrived in America, they walked into something they had not expected: order, calm, and a curious thing they had nearly forgotten: dignity. The camps were guarded, yes, but they were clean. There were beds, medical care, even music from a distant radio in the evenings. The American officers explained the rules slowly, carefully, using gestures where words failed. There would be work farm labor, mending uniforms, helping in warehouses, but there would be pay. They were prisoners, yet they were treated as human beings. At first, the women did not trust it. They waited for cruelty to reveal itself. They slept lightly. They flinched when boots approached. But days passed. Then weeks. The kindness did not stop. American farm families brought them fresh bread after Sunday church. A nurse in a Kansas infirmary taught a German girl how to say, "You're safe now." A young guard offered his winter coat to a woman, shivering in the cold, placing it around her shoulders without a word. Slowly, something began to thaw inside them, something that had been frozen by 4 years of war. They had been told that enemies were monsters, that compassion was weakness. But here, in the middle of the country that had bombed their cities, they found compassion stronger than ideology. Rumors spread through the camps of what awaited them back home. The war was ending. Germany was in ruins. There was hunger, chaos, Soviet soldiers pouring into the east, towns torn apart, families missing. Some of the women had received letters that were just blank pages with one sentence: "We don't know who is alive anymore." And so, when the American officers gathered them one quiet morning and said, "The war is over. You can go home," the words did not fill them with joy. They filled them with fear. Because now they had to choose between the homeland they loved and the safety they had found in the land of their enemy. And no one could make that choice for them. They were moved to small American towns, places of wheat fields, church bells, and dirt roads that stretched to the horizon. From the outside, it looked peaceful. But for the women, every day began with a quiet struggle inside. They were German. They were POWs. They were supposed to be the enemy. So each time they stepped into sunlight, they expected a hard stare, a whispered insult, a door shut in their faces. But something unexpected happened. The townspeople didn't greet them with hatred. They greeted them with a curiosity softened by exhaustion. Americans, too, were tired of war. Brothers, sons, fathers had not yet returned from Europe. Every house had someone missing. Every family knew grief. So when the German women were taken to work on farms or in community workshops, they worked beside people who understood loss just as deeply as they did. On a farm in Nebraska, one young woman named Lise helped harvest wheat. The farmer's wife showed her how to tie her hair against the wind. They never spoke in the same language, but they laughed at the same mistakes. Sweat, dust, and the slow rhythm of the fields smoothed away the sharp edges of conflict. Work made them human to one another. In a camp sewing hall in Texas, a group of German women learned English not in formal lessons, but in shared hands and shared tasks. "Needle," the American foreman said, holding one in the air. "Needle," the women repeated, shyly. The foreman pointed to thread. Thread. Laughter, correction, progress. Small words building bridges, some evenings. The women sat outside behind barbed wire fences, listening to music drifting from nearby dance hall's big band, warm saxophones, voices full of longing. They could see silhouettes inside the windows. People dancing. People living. A world that seemed just out of reach. They thought of home. Of cities bombed to cinders. Of brothers lost at Stalingrad. Of fathers gone to fronts they never came back from. Germany no longer felt like the place they remembered. It was a place of ghosts now. And slowly, something even harder to admit began to grow in their chests. Peace, not joy. Not comfort, but peace. A peace so precious it felt fragile. Then came the letters, slow, uneven, filled with uncertainty. A mother writing from a ruined town, saying, "There is no house left." A sister writing, "We are sleeping in the barn." There is no food. A neighbor writing, "The Soviets are coming." The women hide at night. The German women passed these letters among themselves in silence. America had not become paradise. It had simply become safe. But safety can be terrifying too, because it forces a question no one wants to face. If you find kindness in the hands of your enemy, what does that make everything you were taught? The women had been raised to believe in nationalism, superiority, and absolute loyalty. To doubt those beliefs was to unravel the ground they stood on. To stay in America, to remain in the land they were once told to hate, meant admitting that the world they had grown up believing in was built on lies. They began to feel suspended between two worlds, no longer enemy, not yet accepted, caught in a quiet war inside themselves. And then, one morning, a message arrived from Washington. News that would force every woman to face everything she feared: repatriation. Orders had begun. It was time to go home. Time to choose. The announcement did not come with ceremony. No speeches. No music. Just a plain bulletin posted near the mess hall door, its typed letters slightly crooked from the machine that had printed them. The war was over. The camps were being dissolved. All German prisoners, men and women, would be processed and shipped back across the ocean. The women stood in front of that paper as if it were a verdict. Some stared with numb faces. Others pressed their hands to their mouths to keep their breaths silent. A few stepped away and sat on the ground, unable to stand. They had always known this day would come. But knowing something is inevitable does not make it easier. For months, they had built something fragile here: routine, work, warmth, and the strange beginnings of trust. And trust, once tasted in a world of fear, feels like sunlight after a long winter. It was not something they could easily surrender. One young woman named Marta, who had been a nurse in a military hospital near Aachen, felt her chest tighten as an American officer approached her. He tried to speak slowly, gently. "You'll be leaving in 2 weeks. Ships are ready. You'll be free. You'll go home." His voice sounded like mercy. But to Marta, the words felt like a sentence, because home was not what it once had been. She remembered her mother's last letter, written in handwriting broken by hunger. "The city is mostly rubble now. The bakery is gone. The street where you played is gone. Your father. We still do not know." Marta bowed her head. She could not speak. Across the camp, others wrestled with the same silent battle. Some prayed. Some argued in quiet, strained German. A few wept openly. But many simply walked away into the fields surrounding the camp. Staring at the horizon where America stretched so wide, it felt impossible that it could end. In the days that followed, the atmosphere inside the camp shifted. The fences felt closer. The nights felt shorter. Time was slipping. And then something unexpected happened. The townspeople came to say goodbye. Farmers, shopkeepers, nurses, even the school children who had learned to wave at the camp fence. They brought small gifts, nothing grand, just pieces of ordinary life, a knitted scarf, a jar of preserved peaches, a photograph of a family standing in front of a red barn. A woman placed a Bible into one German girl's hands, pressing it gently, not to convert her, but because she wanted her to have something to hold. That was when the first voice broke the silence of resignation. It belonged to a girl named Helga, barely 19. She stood before the American camp commander, hands trembling, and said in accented English, "Please, I do not want to go back. There is nothing for me there." Her words hung in the room like a held breath. The American officer did not know how to respond. Regulations were clear. Posts must return. That was the rule. But rules do not speak to the human heart. The next day, another woman came forward. Then another. And another. Soon, dozens of German women, former enemies of the United States, were standing in line. Not to leave, but to stay. Their request was not for luxury or comfort. They asked only for permission to live quietly, to work, to rebuild their lives in a place where they had found dignity, and the officers watched them with a solemn "H-E-A-V-I-N-E-S," because they knew the truth. The U.S. government had not expected this. No one had. These women had entered the war as enemies. But somewhere between the wheat fields and the sewing halls, between the shared bread and the quiet music drifting from the towns at night, something stronger than politics or propaganda had taken root. Something deeply human. But wanting to stay and being allowed to stay were not the same thing, and the decision that now lay ahead would test not only the women, but the conscience of a nation. What followed was not a dramatic courtroom scene or a sweeping declaration from Washington. It unfolded quietly, like most turning points in history behind office doors, in stacks of paperwork, in the uncertain space between law and compassion. The American officers, many of whom had watched these women work, laugh, learn, and slowly rebuild the pieces of themselves, now found themselves holding requests that had no official category. These women were not refugees. They were not citizens. They were legally prisoners of war. And prisoners of war were supposed to go home. But home was no longer a place, only a memory. Marta sat across from the camp commander one gray afternoon. Her hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles turned white. She spoke haltingly, searching for English words strong enough to carry her fear. "In Germany, everything is broken," she said. "The cities. You have seen the photographs. There is no work, no food. And the Russians in the east." Her voice cracked, and she had to breathe, slow and deep. "I do not wish to return to a life of being afraid every night." The commander listened, not as a soldier, but as a man who had heard too many stories of war to dismiss another. Across the country, officers sent telegrams to Washington requesting guidance. But the replies came back cold and official. Repatriation must proceed on schedule. No exceptions. And still, the women continued to plead. Helga wrote a letter to the governor of the state where she had been held, explaining that she had begun working as a seamstress and had a sponsor who wished to employ her permanently. She tried to sound formal, composed, but a single line betrayed her heart. "I have found life here. I am afraid to lose it." Farm families quietly spoke up too. A farmer who had lost a son in Belgium argued for the right of a German girl to remain on his land, where she had worked with kindness and diligence. A store owner in Kansas wrote that one of the POW women had cared for his sick wife when no one else could. Enemy, he wrote, is a word that no longer fits. And something began to shift not in law, but in sentiment. But time was running. The ships were scheduled. The camp gates would soon open, only in one direction toward departure. The night before the first transport was scheduled to leave, the women gathered in their barracks. They did not speak loudly. War had taught them to grieve in whispers. Some prayed softly in German. Others sat in silence, hands clasped, eyes unfocused. A few wrote final letters to the American families who had shown them kindness. Leaving them folded on bunks like messages in bottles. Marta stood by the small window, her hand resting on the cold glass, watching the guards walk their slow patterns outside. She thought of the sea voyage back, of the shattered streets she once called home, of the faces she no longer knew would be waiting. And for the first time since childhood, she allowed herself to cry fully, not for what she had lost, but for what she had found. Morning came, footsteps, orders, the gates opened. But when the officers called the first names, something stopped them. The German women did not move. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, silent yet unshakable, not defying. Simply refusing to vanish quietly from the one place where they had felt treated as human beings. It was not rebellion. It was dignity. And in that moment, the officers realized something powerful. These women were no longer prisoners. They were survivors trying to choose their future. But the system had no rules for that. Now the question was no longer whether the women wanted to stay. It was whether America had the courage to let them. The standoff did not last long, not because the women backed down, but because word traveled faster than anyone expected. Newspapers picked up the story. German women POWs begged to remain in U.S. The headlines startled the nation. Americans were used to stories of surrender, victory, and loss, but not of former enemies asking, with tears in their eyes, to stay among them. Letters poured into state offices from citizens who had worked beside the women, eaten with them, learned pieces of their songs and language. These were not soldiers demanding mercy. They were ordinary people who, in the quiet wounds of peacetime, recognized pieces of themselves in the former enemy. Officials from Washington arrived to inspect the camps, expecting manipulation or propaganda. Instead, they found barns patched together jointly by Americans and Germans working side by side. They found fields harvested by hands still trembling from wartime trauma. They found children waving to women behind a wire fence, and the women waving back with smiles both shy and desperate. They found no hatred, only the fragile beginnings of belonging. Under pressure from local communities, the government began to consider an extraordinary compromise: conditional sponsorship. If an American employer or family agreed to house, employ, and take responsibility for a former POW, that woman could apply to remain under supervised civilian status. It was not guaranteed. It was not simple. But it was a door where previously there had been only steel. When the news reached the camps, the silence was overwhelming. Some sank to their knees. Some covered their faces. Some cried openly, no longer caring how they looked. They had survived the war, but this was the first moment. They allowed themselves to believe they might survive the peace. There were interviews, evaluations, endless forms. Not everyone was approved. Some had to return to Germany first, to wait months, even years, before sponsorship could be arranged. They boarded ships with hearts torn in two, but with hope clutched tightly like a letter in a pocket. Others remained quietly, tentatively on American soil. Marta was among them. She found work at a small rural clinic, tending to the elderly and the sick, the work she had done before the world lost its balance. The farmer's wife, who had first shown her how to bind her hair, came to see her often. Not as captor to captive, not as victor to defeated, not as friend to friend. Helga, the girl who first spoke up, became a seamstress. Years later, she would teach her children both German lullabies and American hymns. When asked where she was from, she always paused for a moment before answering, as if the truth lived somewhere between the two. And what of home? Many who returned to Germany found it unrecognizable. Some eventually came back to the United States through new immigration pathways. Others rebuilt lives from ashes, carrying the memory of unexpected kindness in a foreign land like a secret compass. But all of them, those who stayed, those who left, carried one truth: humanity had survived the war, not in treaties, not in speeches, not in victories, not in small acts. Quiet acts. Acts that were never meant to be remembered by history, but mattered anyway.